Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Transatlantic Challenges policy dialogue, which is part of a series that the EPC runs in cooperation with the US mission to the EU. So I'd like to start with thanking the US for their support. Now, the topic of today's event is the Russia-Ukraine crisis and the transatlantic response. The Russian threat to Ukraine remains really critical. Moscow is deploying its full playbook of tools of pressure. Now, Russia has been using a mix of power projection, threats, diplomacy, and other hybrid aggression, including cyber attacks and massive disinformation, to achieve its objectives. But still, it seems at the moment that the Kremlin has not yet decided on war, whatever that may be worth. Moscow has stated over and over again that it does not intend to re-invade. I would say re-invade, they say invade Ukraine. But the fact that Russia continues to have over 100,000 troops on Ukraine's borders really does call this into question. Now, in recent days, tensions have skyrocketed as Russia carried out massive military exercises in Belarus and in occupied Crimea and in the Black Sea. There has also been blockades in the Black Sea. Despite claims from the Kremlin that it would pull back some of these forces, I mean, we haven't seen this really happen yet. Will it happen? That's $1 million question. Now, actually, there's reportedly some 60% of the entire Russian land combat power on Ukraine's borders. I mean, 60%, that's a huge figure. And there's also been new reports today that Ukrainian villages have been shelled from the occupied Donbass. Now, when we look at the West's response, I would say so far we've seen a three-pronged response. Diplomacy. I mean, there's been unprecedented visits from leaders to Russia and many phone calls now between President Putin, Biden, and others. Then we have defense and deterrence and the preparation of tough sanctions that could ravage the Russian economy if they're implemented, in particular, the Defending Ukraine Sovereignty Bill. Now, the uncertainty over what the Kremlin's next move could be, combined with numerous panic-ridden statements by some Western leaders, is having a very negative impact on Ukraine, not least the economy. And this is actually helping Russia to destabilize the country. So today we're going to be discussing state of play. I mean, the situation is moving very quickly, frankly speaking. Different scenarios for tomorrow, but for the future, and the transatlantic response, among other things. And we have a really excellent group of experts with us today who are following developments in and around Ukraine very closely, and who I'm going to briefly introduce. First of all, my colleague, Jamie Shea, who's a senior advisor at the EPC, and he's also former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. Welcome, Jamie. Hanna Shelest, who is Director of Security Programs, Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism, and also Editor-in-Chief of UA Ukraine Analytica. Welcome to you, Hanna. Maria Domańska, who is a Senior Fellow at the OSW Center for Eastern Studies in Poland. And last but not least, Melinda Haring, who is Deputy Director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Now, a big warm welcome to all of you. To the audience, you can ask your questions by clicking on the hand icon or by typing them into the Q&A box. So I'm going to kick off the discussion now. And I'm going to start with you, Jamie. Can you sort of give us your impressions of the state of play today as you see it? Do you see that a Russian incursion of one sort or another is still likely? Does Russia really want to de-escalate? Or is it, simply a question that we have absolutely no idea what's going on in Putin's head? And maybe you can also give us an assessment of the NATO defense ministers meeting that has been taken place over the last couple of days.
Well, Amanda, thanks as always for inviting me. As you know, I'm a big fan of all of your webinars, particularly the ones that you present, and I'm always often as a participant. So it's very nice for a change to be on the podium or with you. So thanks for that. Amanda, you also gave a very good sort of introductory sort of presentation. I think that, clearly the signs that would cause a Western policymaker anxiety are still overwhelmingly more powerful than the signs that would make a Western policymaker breathe a sigh of relief and hope that there is going to be de-escalation. We're not out of the woods yet. The Americans have this famous phrase that it ain't over until the fat lady sings, and I don't see the fat lady anywhere near getting onto the stage yet. I mean, clearly, as you said, Russia has now imposed a stranglehold around Ukraine. This crisis, whatever the outcome, even if there is a de-escalation and a real withdrawal of the Russian forces, won't unfortunately change the situation greatly for either Ukraine or NATO. We're likely to see Russian forces remain in Belarus, even if the Belarusians are assuring us that they will leave after the current so-called Allied Resolve exercise. At least Belarus is being pulled more tightly into a Russian command structure, and the Russians will have greater access to Belarus. That threatens not only Ukraine from the north, but also the Baltic states and Poland in NATO as well. As in the past, the Russians are likely to leave behind a substantial amount of military equipment. They always do that every single time. Ammunition supplies, fuel supplies, command and control elements, in infrastructure, so that they can quickly come back. Therefore, for both Ukraine and NATO, less warning time in the future. Putin is able to sort of ramp it up or ramp it down as he chooses. The third thing is that, unfortunately, we're now going into a kind of permanent invasion of Ukraine, if I can put it this way. Even if Putin does not formally send troops across a border, this perpetual pressure and ramping it up, as you quite rightly yourself, Amanda, said, it puts pressure on the Ukrainian economy, blocks Ukrainian ports for weeks at a time, so they can't export their wheat or their steel or their sunflower oil or whatever, discourages Western investment, keeps the international community in a constant state of tension, keeps Putin as the most visited world leader, a head of state or a foreign minister going to Moscow at least every day. You referred to the cyber attacks, the disinformation campaigns, and so on. So we're going into a kind of latent, patent invasion mode, which, as the Secretary General of NATO, I think quite rightly yesterday said, Jens Stoltenberg, is the new reality that we're facing. The other thing, of course, is that having, as you rightly said, Amanda, amassed 150,000 troops and 50% of the Russian Air Force, a sizable portion of the Navy, all of these forces around Ukraine, Putin probably never had sufficient to occupy Ukraine and conquer it in the classical sense. But even if he withdraws, let's say 2/3 of that force, he's still going to have in the vicinity enough for a salami slice kind of land grab, as we saw in Crimea and in the Donetsk in 2014. And that might have been, of course, his plan all along. So unfortunately, no major breakthrough at the moment. Of course, there are three sort of straws in the wind that Western policymakers will be looking at. The diplomacy continues. In fact, Putin seems to be rather enjoying all of the diplomacy. It's also giving him a public diplomacy platform to continue to get sort of global attention for his sense of victimhood, his sense of grievance, and people seem prepared to visit him. Number two, we know as a sort of a straw in the wind that there may be something on arms control. Putin was quite dismissive of the Western arms control proposals as an off-ramp at the very beginning. He was looking for much bigger fish in terms of a halt to NATO enlargement. And of course, NATO, militarily at least, withdrawing westwards back to its 1997 so-called pre-enlargement borders. But recently you saw, in his sort of stage TV conversation with Lavrov, he seemed to warm to the withdrawal idea. or the arms control idea, excuse me. So maybe there is a potential off-ramp there, which would also help Putin to save face at home. The third thing is that the Russians, as they've always done when they build up their forces around Ukraine, give the pretext that they're only doing exercises. And of course, as the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, said the other day, they were withdrawing now from Crimea back over the land bridge into Russia, or pulling some forces back because the exercises have come to an end. Now, we know that the big exercise in Belarus carries on to the 20th of February, next week. We know that the maritime exercises in the Black Sea and some others go to the end of February. So my sense is that, unfortunately, the Russians are going to keep us on tenterhooks for a week or so yet. And of course, we'll have to see if, as in the past, they use the pretext of the end of the exercise as a reason to explain why they're drawing down. So what does this mean very briefly for, I think, NATO? You mentioned that, Western diplomacy. Well, obviously now two things. Number one, of course, keep the effort up in terms of the threat of sanctions, in terms of the rejection of outlandish Russian proposals, but also in terms of offering the off-ramps where they are in the Western interest, particularly in the area of arms control and military transparency. So as Margaret Thatcher famously said to George H.W. Bush many years ago at Aspen, Colorado, when Saddam invaded Kuwait, this is no time to wobble. This is certainly no time to wobble at all. Keep up the united front. That's the first thing. Secondly, we need to start thinking about the longer term future, that new reality that I think rightly, as I said, Jens Stoltenberg described. Frankly, we now are going to, unfortunately, be in a much more confrontational relationship with Russia, despite our best wishes for some years to come, and notwithstanding all of our attempts to engage Russia in dialogue. So I think this is going to mean five things, and obviously no time to talk about these in detail, Amanda, but maybe we'll come back in questions. Number one, obviously NATO has to reinforce its eastern flank because the Russians are now in much closer proximity to NATO and have NATO invasion options in the wake of this crisis, given that proximity that they didn't have before. I personally have never been a great fan of NATO's strategy of a very light presence in Central and Eastern Europe with the 4 multinational battalions, depending on timely reinforcements. With the much reduced warning time that NATO now has, the ability to quickly move reinforcements across the Atlantic into Eastern Europe in time to parry a Russian attack, that is going to be much more problematic. So I think it's good now that NATO is looking at boosting its presence. The defense ministers look as if they're now going to move towards 4 new multinational battalions, this time more in the Black Sea area. The French have offered to lead in Romania. NATO will be looking for 3 other lead nations for potentially battalions in Romania, Slovakia, and Hungary. Of course, Eastern European allies will be hoping that those additional forces that the US, the UK, Norway, France, the Netherlands, Germany have deployed on a temporary basis will stay there at least for some months until things really do quieten down, thereby offering additional reassurance. And I think the NATO summit in Madrid in June is going to be largely dominated by what new posture NATO has. And again, Amanda, of course, the balance between doing enough to protect NATO while not doing so much that Putin can instrumentalize this as, the NATO threat to Russia. I think that's going to be a balancing act. The second thing, getting those arms control talks underway to achieve greater confidence, extra warning time, more military stability. That's now urgent because all of the architecture that we depended upon that came out of the Cold War, open skies, conventional forces in Europe, no need to get into the details, but unfortunately a lot of that has fallen by the wayside and needs to be recreated. Thirdly, whatever the long-term prospect of Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO, we need to think much harder about how we guarantee the resilience and the stability of those countries. We need not just to wait for a crisis before we see how we reinforce the Ukrainian and Georgian military forces, but how we do it now as a standing activity. The Russians, whether we like it or not, have reopened the big debate on the European security architecture. This is going to be very difficult because the Russian concept is unacceptable to NATO, spheres of influence, and the NATO concept on free choice and enlargement, and no dominant great powers is not acceptable to Russia. So how do we marry 21st century concepts with 19th century concepts in a way that preserves stability and doesn't lead us into a crisis in every 6 months? There's going to be the issue, Amanda, of dependency, the gas issue, Gazprom, Nord Stream 2, not leaving ourselves so vulnerable. It's ironic that a couple of years ago, the European Commission decided that we needed to reduce our dependency on Russian gas below 40%. And a decade later, it's now over 50%. So we haven't done a very good job. And finally, nobody at the moment is thinking very much of the Sahel and the other big part of the news, which is France's decision to end its presence in Mali. And that means, of course, the presence of many other European countries that were partnering with France as well. And this is largely because of Russian interference in the region. So we may not only have a crisis in the east on our hands, but a crisis in the south if Russia increasingly interferes with the NATO, the Western task of stabilizing that area and preventing, for example, jihadism for regaining feet in that area. So unfortunately, as I've said, we're going to be in suspense for some time to come, but we now need to start thinking about long-term and not just short-term crisis management.
Okay, thank you, Jamie, for this, I would say, very comprehensive overview of where things stand. It wasn't a very optimistic insight, I have to say. I mean, permanent invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine's been permanently invaded since 2014. But I think this is the exact right moment to give the floor to Hanna to hear how she sees developments. As viewed from Ukraine. You're in the middle of the storm, so to put it. So I'm going to give the floor to you, Hanna, now.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you for this invitation. Jamie, on one hand, made my work a little bit easier because he already put it in the very nice context, but at the same time, make it a little bit more difficult to grasp what are the emphases and what are the accents that we would like to stress from the Ukrainian side. And if to catch your last phrase about the optimism, I'm always joking that as the citizen, I would like to be very optimistic. As an analyst, unfortunately, I'm becoming more and more pessimistic about the developments, at least of the last few months. And the reasons for this is that we see this evolution of the request from the Russian Federation. We see that it's not only escalation of the political rhetoric, but also of the military forces, but they are coming just hand by hand. And if just a year ago, we heard predominantly from the Russian Federation statements concerning Ukraine, maybe about Ukrainian NATO relations, but it was everything much more local concentrated. It was about Donbass, it was about some developments there, or Russian-speaking population, or orthodoxy, or some other stuff like this. Maximum, it went to attaching Georgia and Moldova in the regional context. However, since December, we definitely saw that the ambitions of the Kremlin leadership raised. And they started to speak about the European security. They started to speak about future of NATO. They started to speak about other NATO member states. Because returning back to 1997, you're speaking not about Ukraine. You're not speaking about the last few countries. You're speaking about all Eastern European countries that joined NATO starting from 1999. And in this way, we understand perfectly that that would be completely different configuration of the NATO and the idea of NATO that for the last 20 years we are living in. So this raise of ambitions on the one hand is what making this situation more dangerous because some of the European leaders can agree to bargain on something smaller, and this smaller can be seen Ukraine and Ukrainian future, just to secure that bigger, meaning the future of NATO, for example, or the European security as its name. So that's why these ambitions are so dangerous from our opinion. The second problem is that despite Russia is announcing each time that we just would like to speak about our security, about our concerns, because you don't hear us, but each time when they are called for the negotiations, except of the Moscow-Washington level, they're escaping them. Vienna document, the very important document in terms of arms control and exercises control that's in place since the beginning of 2000s, being evoked by Ukraine just recently. What Russia did, first, they failed the deadline of 48 hours, according to this document, to present the written reply. They didn't reply after something like 50 or 60 hours, they sent just a letter that we don't want to reply. And then, according to the procedures, Ukraine called for the OSCE meeting. And today, Russia rejected participation in this meeting. So one of the basics documents that Russia itself been referring all the time, they're just not coming to these type of the meetings. Ukrainian president called, okay, let's meet and talk. No, we don't see the substance why we should meet with you. It is just today the new statement from the press secretary of the Russian president. But in this way, the Russian Federation is ignoring not only Ukraine, but mostly European leaders as well. Definitely, there are visits of some leaders, some politicians to Moscow. But at the same time, if you follow the way of the arguments and the way how press conferences happen, you understand perfectly that Putin is not respecting them. He's thinking, okay, you came here, you think you're important, but I want to speak only with Washington. I want to speak only with Biden. And at each press conference, he's really humiliating the leadership of many European countries and just emphasizing this. Perfect examples that just happened when immediately during the press conference, you have, for example, the press conference after meeting with Putin, and Russian parliament is adopting decision to ask Russian president to recognize independence of uncontrolled territories. Say that it is not a humiliation in terms of diplomatic practice. It was not a coincidence. However, if just to go further from this, there are also quite bad developments that we see within the last 48 hours. Even that Russia announced the certain withdrawal of the forces, but de facto intelligence services of many countries reported that it being not withdrawal, but increase of the forces by 7,000. So we see the certain movements, but we don't see any withdrawal. Even more, a few days ago, they constructed the temporary bridge along the river, which is just 6 kilometers from Ukrainian territory near the Chernobyl zone. So if you look to the map, and that is not the constructions you're doing just for exercises, for example, or something like this. If you go to the south and look to the Black Sea, yes, we already been in the situation when the Russian Federation tried to block quite a significant areas within the Black Sea. There were times, if I'm not mistaken, in 2020, we had a few days when Russia closed 25% of the Black Sea simultaneously for the exercises. Or better to say, very often it is so-called exercises because they are closing these areas for commercial navigation, but not doing any activities there. However, this time we had two unprecedented cases. First, in April last year, they closed the territory for 6 months. I would tell you that from the international practice, maritime practice, nobody is closing for 6 months for maritime exercises, for Navy exercises. You're closing for a few hours. You can close for 6 months, but for example, saying that each Tuesday from 11 till 12, we will have certain activities. However, if you read the notice, it's been just closing for 6 months from April till October. Then they canceled it. But what we have since Sunday, they announced first 3 zones, then they increased it to 5 zones in the northern Black Sea. Initially, they just closed completely the Sea of Azov, but then they realized that by this closing, even ships coming to the Russian ports would not be able to come. So they changed a little bit the geography of it. But what they did near Odessa, they managed to close the whole part between Crimea and Ukraine and Romania, and left just a very, very narrow line of few miles. They didn't violate the territorial waters of Ukraine, but they closed by these exercises with shooting, as they were named, the recommended maritime routes to enter all Ukrainian ports. Why I'm explaining it so in detail? Because Ukrainian exports, 60%, in some years up to 70% of Ukrainian export is going through ports. Not railway, no tracks, it is by shipping, maritime shipping. And from this amount, 70% are going through the ports of big Odessa, so Odessa, Chernomorsk, and Pivdenny. You can imagine how significantly it could influence not only commercial shipping, Ukrainian economy, but also world supply of food, because Ukraine is one of the biggest world exporters of grains, barley, of wheat, not speaking about the ore and other natural resources. So, for example, such countries as Lebanon last year received 50% of their wheat from Ukraine. And when you understand this situation, not just, okay, they closed for 1 week the navigation near Ukrainian ports, what the problem, it's not a blockade. But then when you look at this supply chain, you understand perfectly what long-term consequences such actions can have. And that is the new tactic of the Russian Federation, when they understand that maybe military is good for everybody to be panicking, but the real actions are happening on the different fronts. And definitely the last point at which I will stop, it is cyber. And definitely we had a lot of cyber attacks within these years. If I'm not mistaken, last year our security services reported up to 30,000 cyber attacks against Ukrainian governmental agencies. But this year in January, we had one of the biggest attacks against the governmental institutions. And just a few days ago, we had the biggest within the last few years DDoS attack, DOS attack, against the banks and against the armed forces and Ministry of Defense. So this level of increasing operations that are taking all possibilities, all loopholes of security or of weak points, let's say, that definitely is demonstrating that the Russian Federation currently is not looking for any type of the not even speaking about compromise, but at least of the slowdown of their pressure against Ukraine and against Ukrainian partners.
Thank you, Hanna. I mean, you raised a lot of really important points there. I think perhaps in the Western media, there's been a lot of attention on the possibility of a mass invasion and perhaps not so much attention on some of these other issues. Such as the ones you just mentioned, the supply chains, the ports, the cybersecurity, which is, you know, typical of the Russian strategy on these things. So I want to stay with the topic of Russia now and move to Maria, who's a well-known expert on Russia as well, to hear her insights on, I mean, what do you see now as Russia's main goal? I mean, in the West, there's been a lot of talk about Russia looking for an off-ramp at this point after, you know, let's say 3 months of surrounding Ukraine, not yet achieving any of its main goals. I mean, do you think that Russia is looking for an off-ramp? I'm not so sure. And how do you see the next steps that could possibly follow from the Kremlin, from where we are today?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here, first of all. I will try to be as brief as possible, although the topic is really huge. Well, in my opinion, the biggest problem is that this conflict is not as much about Ukraine itself. It's a kind of proxy conflict. It's a fundamental conflict with the West. And this is not about any specific negotiable issues, be it in the sphere of security or any other sphere. This is viewed by Moscow as a fundamental geopolitical and civilizational even conflict, as liberal democracy and the whole Western project is considered to be an existential threat to the Russian ruling regime, including a threat to the safety of its beneficiaries. And in 2014, we in fact saw the Brezhnev doctrine reactivated by Moscow. I mean, the idea of some kind of a forward defense against a hostile ideology. Moscow treats, for these reasons, Moscow treats the rivalry with NATO as a zero-sum game. So I don't see any middle ground here to reach any kind of stable compromise. And in my opinion, Russia's ultimate strategic goal vis-a-vis NATO and the European Union is to dismantle these organizations. It's not about anything less. And their goal is to deal with, and then after dismantling these organizations, to deal with individual states that would become automatically less resilient to Russian political leverage. And in the light of these goals, the conviction prevailing in some countries that they would never fall victim to Russia's aggressive actions is, in my view, a serious misconception. Just some interim thoughts on the ongoing negotiations after the recent visits by French and German leaders. It seems that after quite a resolute and coherent reaction by NATO to the Russian ultimatum, we see some signs of disunity within the EU. And apparently Russia is trying to reassure itself that the collective West cannot resist crude blackmail for a longer time and will sooner or later get split and banned if confronted with psychological warfare. And the worst case scenario here is not the Russian pressure on Ukraine, but the Western pressure on Kyiv to satisfy Russian demands. And the whole situation is, of course, dramatically difficult to manage because Russia has much more leverage on us than vice versa. So in my view, Russia is in fact locking us step by step in a totally false paradigm, which boils down to justifying blatant violation of the international law by Russia's alleged legitimate security concerns. I mean, it sounds from time to time in the rhetoric of some Western leaders. The narrative that Russia feels threatened by NATO is a total fake. I mean, it doesn't. They understand very well that NATO doesn't pose any threat to Russia. It's just an excuse to present Russia, the aggressor, as a victim. As I work also on Russian politics of memory, I would say that it's quite telling that they create the historical narratives also within the same paradigm. For example, nowadays in Russia, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the subsequent territorial annexations are justified as self-defense. Within this false paradigm, we also have a sort of a false symmetrism, as if the war in Ukraine was some kind of a natural disaster that no one is responsible for, or both sides are equally responsible for. And for example, we refuse to deliver defensive weapons to Ukraine, which would be one of the few tools we still have to increase the cost of potential aggression for Russia, but we keep talking about Russian understandable or legitimate security concerns. Another thing is that Russia tries to convince the West that peace and stability for the whole Europe can be bought at the expense of the third party's sovereignty. It can't. Another important issue is the indivisible security, as Moscow defines it. Some of the European leaders repeat that we should build our security only together with and not against Russia, in the situation where Russia has become the main destabilizing force in Europe that created a close to war conflict absolutely out of nothing. I can't see any real common security interest between Moscow and the West for the reasons I've mentioned. And I'm asking myself whether it's just politically expedient rhetoric, let's not act against Russia, or is it a false belief that continues to prevail? So in my opinion, instead of letting ourselves get locked in this false paradigm, the West should first of all think out of the box and adapt our foreign policy tools, not to our illusions about how to deal with Russia, but to Russia's actual strategic culture. So instead of paying Russia off with long-term concessions in the name of short-term gains, like an illusory de-escalation, we should rather send proper messages. We should build a coherent strategic communication instead of sending contradictory messages, because now we see that different Western leaders send different messages to Moscow. And we should start to act and not only react to Russia's policies. We should sort of seize the agenda and make Russia react to our steps. And in my opinion, a very good example of seizing the agenda were the warnings from the US about Russia planning to start a new active phase of war, because it forced Moscow to deny it publicly over and over again. So Russia became kind of a hostage to their own public declarations, which was quite good. But now I see that, okay, we have offers of dialogue. Offers of dialogue are understandable in this situation, but if they are not accompanied by tougher measures, they are viewed by the Kremlin as a weakness and a green light to push forward. And, you know, if we start counting from 2008 in Georgian war, 14 years of our constructive policy of dialogue vis-a-vis Moscow, and our reluctantly implemented and limited sanctions have brought us where we are today, with Russia sending us an unacceptable ultimatum and threatening with another military aggression against its neighbor in the very center of Europe. Now a couple of words about how Russian public views this crisis, and based on the surveys by the independent Levada Center. The main trends in the public moods include, first of all, the high level of fear of war. But at the same time, there is quite considerable skepticism about the possible outbreak of a Russian-Ukrainian war, or a war between Russia and NATO or the US, because the Russians in general see this conflict not as a Russian-Ukrainian dispute, but as a sort of a proxy war between Russia and the West. Around 50% of Russians blame the West for the escalation of tensions. So this is visibly a passive consumption of the state propaganda. But also we should remember that we don't know which part exactly, but some part of the people taking part in the surveys are just afraid of openly expressing the views that they are perfectly aware run counter to some basic state interests as presented by the state propaganda. There is a quite high expectation that there won't be any war, and then the parties to the conflict will be able to agree and avoid the military conflict. There is also a growing fatigue with foreign topics, including the Ukrainian topic. At the same time, there is no visible signs of social mobilization around the authorities, even if for the last many weeks, there was a huge wave of the anti-Western hysteria in the state media. The approval ratings of Putin's policies and Putin himself oscillate at roughly the same level for the last months. So there is no anti-war mobilization, but there is also no rally around the flag effect. People are rather focused on their everyday problems and feel, understandably, they feel suppressed by the last year's wave of repression, which was unprecedented in the history of the Russian Federation. Of course, in the case of a real and not potential hypothetical military conflict, there may be a short-term increase of public support for the government, for the authorities. But the question is for how long and what its scale would be. And just my last point, because usually we in the West, when we see the results, such results of public opinion surveys in Russia, we usually say, oh my God, the Kremlin has full support of the society, and why Russians are so imperial oriented and so forth, and so on and so forth. I think that we can't blame Russians that they passively absorb this anti-Western state propaganda, and that they do not oppose their government, even in the case when there is a visible threat of an armed conflict. Because the deteriorating situation with human rights in Russia and this passive acceptance of the Kremlin's aggressive foreign policy are in fact two sides of the same coin. So my principal thesis is that as long as Russia remains authoritarian, as long as human rights will continue to be violated in Russia, we will have to deal with an aggressive country conducting aggressive foreign policy with, unfortunately, some kind of passive acceptance on the part of the society. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. You also raised a lot of interesting issues. I mean, it's how the domestic and foreign policy is linked is definitely a topic that's worth exploring further as well, perhaps in this discussion. At this point, I would like to remind the audience that they can put their questions either by clicking on the raised hand icon or by putting them in the Q&A box. But now I want to turn to Melinda, who's been very patient, and come back to the point that you made, Maria, about how the West should be, seizing the agenda. Melinda, is this something that you think that the West should be doing more of? I mean, are we being too reactive and perhaps not enough proactive? And at the same time, how would you assess US policy so far? I mean, as was mentioned in the beginning, for President Putin, Biden is viewed as his counterpart. He's the guy that he wants to sit with. It's the guy he wants to have the conversations with. So what do you see as, being the main, concrete results so far from US or Western diplomacy? I mean, if there have been any concrete results, because it's not really that clear, actually.
Hey, Amanda, it's great to be here. Thanks for the opportunity. And I share Jamie's praise. I love your webinars and your great questions. So let me be as brief as possible so we can get to questions from your great audience. So President Biden is doing an okay job. He's not doing a fabulous job. He's not doing a terrible job. I would probably give him a B. A month ago, I would have given him a C. So the administration is waking up to the Russian threat. President Biden thought that a mix of deterrence and a mix of the meanest, nastiest package of sanctions that Russia has ever seen would be enough to deter Vladimir Putin. And it hasn't done the trick. So Biden and his team, have put together this package of sanctions. We don't know the details. The White House has not told the expert community, but we do know that his team has told Moscow, do it, and here's what you're going to face. I'm not a sanctions expert, but I work with a lot of sanctions experts, and they say that the current package of sanctions that we have on Russia is about a 2 to 3, so it's pretty weak. And the package that we would throw at Russia if they invaded again is more like an 8 or 9, and it does not include SWIFT. We know that for sure, but there are other ways to get very close to SWIFT without using the SWIFT bomb. So it is a mean, nasty package of sanctions, but you also have to put it in the context of Russia's international reserves. Russia has $630 billion in the bank. So it's really a question of how scared are they, at these threats. I would not give the Biden administration very good marks, though. They could be putting sanctions in place now. There's no reason to wait. And their argument is if we do it now, then we won't have the Europeans on board. Well, you don't know until you try, would be my response to that. On deterrence, they're doing a pretty damn good job. They've sent 15 or 16, I don't know what the latest number, plane loads of gear over. They need to be sending Stingers now and not sending, second generation Stingers from the Baltic states. I'm not sure what the holdup is. Now time is of the essence. Let's do it. There's no good reason to delay. So, the other piece that I would say is the Biden administration should have pushed NATO to put more troops in Eastern Europe earlier on. I know it's NATO's decision, but the Biden administration could show a lot of leadership there and try to make that happen. I just got back from Kiev about a week and a half ago, Amanda, and the mood there is weird. It's a mix of avoidance and fatalism. So no one wants to talk about it. Everyone wants to have a drink and talk about anything but the menacing Russian troops sitting on Ukraine's border. And to say that there's a big difference of an opinion between Kiev and Washington, is the understatement of the year. So Washington has said, oh my God, the Russians are coming almost every single day, for a while. And Kiev and Zelensky have said, cool it, cool your jets. You're ruining our economy. And they're artificially propping up their economy right now. And it is hurting, right? We have to be real about that. They don't disagree about the threat assessment. So Zelensky and his team are not saying, no, it's not 150,000 troops. It's actually 110. That's not the dispute. Everyone agrees about the number, but it's the interpretation that they disagree about. And I would actually give Zelensky big marks. I'm not a Zelensky fan. I think he did a terrible job on reform last year. This panel's not about that. We could save it for another time. But he's done a good job as the commander-in-chief. He's showed a stiff upper lip. And he is not hiding in the bunker. Yesterday was Unity Day, and he asked everyone to come out and sing the national anthem at 10. I think he hasn't done a very good job, though, hardening the long, porous border between Ukraine and Russia. And the Ukrainians should have gotten their act together earlier and put plans together in place. They did pass legislation to put territorial defense units together. Fabulous. But there's a lot more that could be done. So in general, I think, let's talk about Biden's speech too. He gave a very good speech this week. I know that your listeners saw. And the thing that stuck out at me was his emphasis on the Article 5 guarantees. So he said, yes, NATO's Article 5 guarantees extend to our neighbors, and they are ironclad, and we will enforce them. There was this fear that, if Putin goes into Ukraine, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and Biden has made it very, very clear that we will not put boots on the ground there. There was a fear that if that happens, that Washington might get a little wobbly with Lithuania and Poland. I don't think so. I don't think that's going to happen. I will say that Biden did screw up, though. This was really dumb. He said over and over again, we're not going to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. Okay, that might be your policy, but you don't need to telegraph that to Putin. You want to have some strategic ambiguity. You want to scare the Russians as much as you can. We're playing a very weak hand, and I think we should be honest about that. Don't tell them what you're not going to do if you don't have to. So I think that was really dumb. But in general, Biden's team is doing okay, and I think they're waking up and they're communicating really clearly. And I would give them high marks for being open about the threat. And I think the Brits did a good job of showing the plot as well, 2 weeks ago. So it's good to be open with the intelligence, but let's not ruin the Ukrainian economy. That's the big issue right now. I just wrote a piece for the National Interest that I hope you'll drop in the chat. And my big worry is that Putin's just going to sit on the border and menace Ukraine indefinitely for the next 2 years. He's going to try to destroy the Ukrainian economy. Hanna outlined what that means. And then he's going to try to break the will of the Ukrainian people. And he's not going to be successful there. So I end on a note of optimism and hope, Amanda, because 45% of Ukrainians have said that they will fight if Putin invades their country again. Thank you.
Thanks, Melinda. And maybe I can just ask an additional question. I mean, do you think it was a mistake? I mean, that the West has basically told Putin, including vis-a-vis sanctions, exactly what they're going to be doing or what they have. I mean, we've exposed our whole hand of cards, so to speak, while the Russians haven't really shown any cards. I mean, how detrimental could that be? I mean, moving forward.
I think it's good that we communicated the sanctions package, but you have to remember that this is a first resort. We can do a lot more than that, right? I think, though, that our deterrence game was weak. That's where I would give them low marks at the beginning. It's getting better. But again, I don't think you telegraph to Putin certain things are off the table. I work with 4 brilliant military fellows at the Atlantic Council, and they said, listen to Biden carefully. He has not ruled out the use of Air Force or the use of ships. So if Putin does invade Ukraine, the US could hypothetically use its Air Force and use ships to strike back if it came to it. So let's be talking about that. Let's try to convince Moscow that there are options that they really don't want to countenance.
Okay, thank you. I want to come back to you now, Jamie, for a second question. I don't see that the audience is being very, active yet, so I encourage them to put their questions. But I mean, I just want to come back to this issue of Russia's, so-called security concerns. I mean, do you see that there are any legitimate concerns that the Russians do have? Or is it entirely, one large, fabrication?
Well, you know, Amanda, Henry Kissinger once said, talking about the Soviet Union, that absolute security for the Soviet Union means absolute insecurity for everybody else. And so you cannot have a situation where one country out of what, 57 or so members of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe says that the whole system has to be sort of redefined and re-articulated around my own sort of national fears and phobias and interests, and that I have the right, if you like, to impose buffer zones and neutrality and so on all kinds of other states. You know, this has got to be something where everybody has a seat at the table, where everybody has a voice. And I totally agree with what's said up till now. I think one of the things that the West has to do is get off the back foot in articulating how it sees its own legitimate security interests. I mean, the problem is that we've got some principles that you know well that were enshrined in the Paris Charter at the end of the Cold War in 1990, or in the Istanbul Charter, also an OSCE document of 1999, such as indivisibility of security. No state should define its security at the expense of another. Rights of countries to join the alliance, an alliance if they so choose. And of course, you know, these principles can be interpreted in frankly rather sort of different ways. And I think, you know, one of the things that we now are going to have to do, whether we like it or not, is sit down with the Russians and try to come to some sort of understanding about what we really mean by those. But clearly, you know, what the West has to do, whatever happens with this crisis, is not sort of give ground on everything that has been achieved since the end of the Cold War, you know, not only through NATO, but through the EU, through Helsinki, you know, in drawing up a number of rules of the road. And also just to remind the Russians that they have signed up to these principles as well. You know, they signed up to the right of states to join an alliance in Istanbul. They guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. I think, you know, in NATO, the real difficulty here is that we did have a period in the 90s with Putin in charge in the Kremlin, where we were having, on the one hand, NATO enlargement going ahead. Not to say that the Russians were particularly happy about that, but we're also developing NATO-Russia cooperation elsewhere, you know, places like Afghanistan, in dealing with piracy in the Gulf of Aden, in dealing with counterterrorism. And there was a real sense at the time that you could have your cake and eat it too. And I agree with what was said by Hanna about the end of illusions, that the West is realizing that probably these two things can't be balanced for the time being. But you know, what NATO did at the end of the Cold War, and this is why I find, you know, this idea, very briefly, of moving back to 1997 border so absurd, is that when the new member states joined NATO, NATO issued a so-called 3 no's reassurance to Moscow that NATO would enlarge, but it would have almost no direct military consequences: no nuclear weapons, no substantial combat forces, no infrastructure on the territory of new member states. And for much of my time as a NATO official, I was listening to complaints. I remember a complaint once from Radek Sikorski when he was Polish foreign minister, saying, "Jamie, we've been in NATO for 15 years, and what have we got to show for it? Only a virtual training center in Bydgoszcz." You know, he was articulating the idea that, you know, NATO was not providing security guarantees through military hardware. So to some degree, you know, to argue, as the Kremlin does, that NATO enlargement initially led to some juggernaut of NATO military power being deployed in Eastern Europe threatening Russia is complete nonsense. And the only NATO deployments that have taken place, modest as they are, have been in response to Russian aggression against Georgia, against Ukraine, and so on. So yes, I mean, you know, so NATO, so the problem for us is that the Russians create the very phobia that they then say we have to solve in their place.
Jamie, I'm going to ask you a question that we had just got from Melinda, from the fellow panelist: how to move out of the impasse over European security architecture. That's a difficult question to answer, isn't it?
Yeah, I give it. Melinda's question is very good, and I suppose the first thing is don't backtrack from where we are. you know, if you can't sort of advance up the football field, at least, you know, sort of continue to occupy the ground that you've managed to, if you like, have so far, which is, you know, the principle of equal security for NATO members, the credibility of guarantees, you know. But obviously the problem for NATO is if we started to sort of compromise on security guarantees for our Eastern European members, everybody would immediately realize that NATO security guarantees are worthless, and de facto that would be the end of the alliance. It's either all together or nothing. Not to compromise on the issue of membership for other countries, you know, not to take off the table the promise that NATO made in Bucharest to Georgia and Ukraine. Because again, if Russia starts getting a veto on NATO's decision making, you can have that country but not that country. You can have a tank in that country but not a tank in that country. No decision could be taken without getting the approval of Moscow in advance. What we are actually doing is breaking up that security structure that we've worked so hard to have. So I agree, there are times in history when advancing further is difficult, but at least don't give up what you've already managed to gain.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. I'm going to put a couple of questions by Zigo Rutkovisk. I hope I pronounced that, you know, reasonably okay. First of all, he's asking, what's the reason why the West doesn't impose sanctions on Putin and his inner circle, including the oligarchs? And his second question is regarding, well, he's asking, what's your opinion on the Russian answer today to the earlier reply from the US and NATO to the Russian demands? What steps will you expect to follow? So maybe, Maria, I could ask you to answer. I mean, maybe the first question about the sanctions. Would you like to take that one?
Well, frankly, please repeat the question about the sanctions.
Why doesn't the West put sanctions on Putin and his inner circle already, including the oligarchs?
Well, it's it's an extremely difficult question because we are in fact getting back now to the endless topic of the lack of political will to contain and deter Russia at the moment when we are still able to effectively do it. I mean, this overriding paradigm of Western political thinking is that if we issue warnings that we do something unless Russia does something, this sends Russia a signal that these are only words. So I'm just going to give you one example. I mean, July 2014 and MH17. This was the moment when we decided to impose economic sanctions on Russia. When since the spring of 2014, we had kept repeating that unless Russia withdraws from Crimea, we would introduce economic sanctions. They totally ignored our warnings, and they were perfectly correct in assessing our true readiness to deter them, which was close to zero. So the question why we didn't do certain necessary things is not probably the question to me, it's a question to our political leadership in Europe. The problem is, I think, that we either don't understand or don't want to understand Russian strategic culture, which is based not on the culture of dialogue, not on words, but on force, including military force as a standard tool in the foreign policy, and on the whole arsenal of active measures, including blackmail, brinkmanship, and using language as an offensive tool of dealing with opponents, because we should also remember that language in Russian case serves not to communicate true intentions, but quite often it serves to communicate intentions totally opposite to the real ones. And what is really like disheartening and worrying in this situation is that for the last 8 years, we've seen that our sanctions didn't work. I mean, we've got only escalation of the situation. And we let Russia, we offered Russia enough time to adapt to our sanctions, in fact. So this policy proved counterproductive. And the most dramatic moment about it is that being now in 2022, we have still not learned lessons from that. I mean, we are still saying that if Russia invades Ukraine or re-invades Ukraine, I agree with you, Amanda, that the war has been waged for the last 8 years. So it's nothing new, in fact. But I think that if we keep talking, if you invade, we will impose tougher sanctions, it's also counterproductive because they don't believe us, because they are really not convinced we are ready to do anything substantial. So my opinion is that we should envisage additional, much tougher sanctions, not only if Russia makes another aggressive step, but also if there is no de-escalation in its current policies. They still occupy a part of the Ukrainian territory. I'm even not talking already now about Crimea, which is quite obvious. I'm talking about Donbass, which is a stronghold of separatism and the point from where they can destabilize Ukraine for many years to come. If we don't impose tougher sanctions right now, punishing Russia for not de-escalating the situation, they will continue to believe that what has been gained so far has been gained forever, and that they can, and it can be a new starting point for new demands, because I'm pretty sure that if we make concessions now, even minor concessions, Russia will continue to make further and further demands, seeing that we are ready to continue this dialogue that hasn't brought any fruit for the last 8 years or 14 years, if we count from 2008. So really, this is a fundamental question about whether we are ready, and sorry for this formulation, intellectually able and operationally able to adapt our tools of foreign policy to Russian strategic culture, to speak to them using a language they would understand and they couldn't ignore. That's the question, of course.
Thank you, Maria. I'm going to take a couple of other questions. First from Andrew Duff, who's basically asking, shouldn't the EU and NATO together create a concept of a robust buffer zone for Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova under Western patronage, rather than this issue of NATO membership, which he says is a distraction. And then I would like to ask Hanna if she could say a few words about the potential for actually a Russian provocation in the Donbass. I mean, as we know, there's already been shelling, but is it possible we're going to see a provocation in the Donbass by Russia that could escalate? And attached to that, the issue of the Normandy format and the talks over the Minsk agreements, that, you know, there's been a couple of meetings. I mean, but where do you see the next steps in this process? I mean, is there a risk here that Ukraine could get, you know, pushed into a corner to make some concessions here?
Thank you,
Maybe
Amanda.
I'll ask you to go first, Hanna.
Yes, and I also, if possible, briefly refer to buffer zone. You know, that is the phrase that really make people very angry here in Ukraine for all these years, because buffer zones, it's something that you don't care about. It's something that protects you, maybe, or something unknown for you, some kind of the gray zone. So probably if European citizens prefer to think about Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia as a buffer zone, it means us to think about them as no land. It's not, it just to give like, you know, a lot of the free space around you, so the coyotes or wolves would not come to your house. But in this way, you're not taking any responsibility, you don't cooperate, you don't care, it's just some kind of the buffer zone. And in this way, you're definitely excluding any type of the subjectivity, the agency to Ukrainian people, Ukrainian government. And you know, when I heard this 8 years ago working in Rome, I was frustrated, but Italians at least named it a little bit softer. In their translation, the buffer zone is the cushion for your chair. So you feel comfortable at this chair. But at the same time, after 8 years, it seems to me that is really very offensive for the Ukrainian people to speak about them as the buffer zone. You're speaking about more than 40 million people. You're speaking about one of the biggest countries. And that is exactly what Russia would like, because for them, the buffer zone would be easier than getting the strong Ukraine that have a right to choose, because the buffer zone doesn't have a chance to choose where they would like to be and how to develop. So if we go to the current provocations, definitely what is happening since morning is the clear demonstration of readiness to any type of the provocation. For the last few weeks, a lot of colleagues discussed that false flag operation can be probably the good start for the Russian Federation, because they are looking for the excuse to enter Ukrainian territory. They lost a moment when it can be a surprise. And definitely just to enter Ukraine, they would be portrayed as an aggressor, and they don't want to be portrayed as an aggressor. They pretend that they are victim of the NATO enlargement, and that it's some crazy people in Ukraine that they need to protect others from Ukrainian government. That's why we were afraid of false flag operation. However, this morning we had 20 Ukrainian towns being shelled, and including civilian destroying, of civilian buildings. One of them is the kindergarten, where kids been at that time already. And we have people with the contusions, with the wounds. We have the school in another town being with the bombs at their territory. So, and if you see what types of the weapons being used, most of these weapons are out of the Minsk agreements. So what been prohibited according to the Minsk agreements, they used 120, 150 millimeters artillery, definitely not what is allowed according to the Minsk. That's why when we're talking about the Minsk, Ukraine never said that we are not going to fulfill it. The question is that Russia would like to read only one article from there, elections and autonomy. Russians ignoring completely the articles about withdrawal of the foreign military from uncontrolled territories, access of the OSCE monitors to the whole territory of Ukraine. And during the pandemic, the OSCE special monitors had extreme difficulties to getting to the uncontrolled territories. They've been prevented from this all the time. You can find these in their weekly reports. Security of the situation, as you see with today's fight, it's definitely not a ceasefire. And just at the Normandy meeting a few days ago, they agreed to the yet one round of the ceasefire. Difficult to name this huge fight in the morning as the ceasefire. And then elections. How you can organize elections when you don't have even the smaller way of security? And okay, let's forget about physical security, because one can say you have elections in Sudan or in some other countries where you still had problems, or in Iraq. No problem. How to organize elections if 2 million people don't have access to their voting rights, because we have almost 2 million of the internally displaced people? How to organize elections when you don't have access of media, of those who are in, how do you call it, National Election Committee, the organization that should organize the meeting, of Ukrainian political parties? So it means that we need to organize some kind of the fake elections with violation of all OSCE norms and principles for the fair elections. And then what? Then have even bigger conflict, because nobody will recognize those elected as a legitimate power, but at the same time jeopardizing the rights of 2 million people to select the future for their region. just because they cannot return physically for the territory where they've been just kicked off by the Russian aggression. So it seems to me that it is really very cynical behavior of the Russian Federation to impose elections and not speaking about how to organize these elections. And do we have even basic conditions to have them?
Thank you, Hannah. I want to put these last couple of questions because we just have 5 minutes left. The first one is from Dimitri Kolpakis, who's asking what confidence building measures could be used for diplomacy to work, or should we conclude that diplomacy is hopeless? Maybe I can give that question to you, Melinda. And then this question here related to NATO membership. Short of Ukraine and other non-NATO European countries joining NATO, what long-term policy should Europe and NATO pursue to guarantee non-NATO nations' security? That's $1 million question, really, isn't it? And maybe you can take that one, Jamie, as that's sort of your NATO field. So I give the floor to you first, Melinda.
Thanks, Amanda. The answer, unfortunately, is no. Diplomacy is on life support, and I think that the sooner we acknowledge that, the better. I think Jamie explained very, very cogently why. Moscow has a very different view of the European security architecture than the West does. And there's no cute diplomatic formula to get around this. You know, we can rearrange the deck furniture on the Titanic, but the boat is, you know, the trajectory of the boat is very negative. And I don't know if you saw in the chat, Amanda, the Russians just put out a response to the US response to its security demands that it made in December. And it's incredibly grim. I encourage everyone to get on the Kommersant website and have a look at it. I'm even more depressed now after looking at it. Over to Jamie.
Yeah, thanks, Melinda. Thanks, Amanda. First of all, on what's often and rather insultingly called Finlandization. Andrew Duff and I are great friends. We're fellow liberals. We're fellow British Europeans, but I disagree with him on the buffer zone. I think Hanna expressed it very well. I mean, the thing is that neutrality is not something that can be imposed on a country. It's freely chosen. And during the Cold War, a country like Finland chose neutrality because it figured out that it would live in a more stable way in Europe and with Russia by sticking to that. And basically, there were three conditions. Number one, it could join the EU, even if it didn't choose to join NATO. That option doesn't seem to be on the table for Ukraine. The whole Maidan crisis back in 2014 was provoked not by Ukraine coming close to NATO, but by the Ukraine wishing to sign a deep and comprehensive trade agreement with the EU. So, you know, so if Putin is ruling out even EU membership for Ukraine, that doesn't help them to see their future as a viable neutral state. The second thing is military. The Finns sustained their neutrality by spending a lot on defense and having a very well-trained and equipped army, which inflicted a bloody nose on the Soviet Union back in 1940. Even last week, Amanda, Finland signed a contract with the US to buy 64 F-35 Joint Strike Fighter aircraft for nearly $10 billion. So armed, effective military force as a deterrent is also, interestingly, part of neutrality. The final thing is neutrality also implies the right to give up neutrality if one day you decide it's not working for you. And it was very interesting, Amanda, that when Putin began to lobby against any further NATO enlargement, one of the strongest pushbacks that he had was from President Niinistö, who is a bridge between Europe and Moscow, saying, no, you know, we think that, but not even President Putin. You know, the neutrality that may have worked in the Cold War doesn't work today. States that have declared neutrality, for example, Moldova, Ukraine, have been invaded by Russia. So unfortunately, you know, they have to look at the facts and decide that, you know, maybe only NATO provides them with the security that they want. And again, Russia has caused the problem, which it's now calling on us to solve for them. Finally, just one quick word, no quick fix. I mean, a lot of people around today, and we had this in the 1930s when we were dealing with the authoritarians at that time, will always argue there's a quick fix, give up the notion of membership for Ukraine or Georgia and all will be well. Everything will return to the happy halcyon days. There will be no more crises in Europe. No, that's not true. There's no quick fix. I think we need to realize that we're dealing with a much more fundamental problem. I think Maria described it absolutely brilliantly, if you don't mind my saying so. And we need to think about, Houston, we have a problem, no quick fix. What is going to be our long-term approach to this issue, which, given that Putin clearly is not going to leave power anytime soon, is unfortunately going to be with us for at least the next decade.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. Unfortunately, I have to close this dialogue now because we've run out of time. And unfortunately, I also have to agree there's going to be no quick fix. I did read that Kommersant piece as well, and you're really right, Melinda. It's incredibly depressing, and you can understand very well this crisis is going to drag on for the foreseeable future at the very least, which is it's a disaster for Ukraine, but also it remains a major test for the transatlantic leadership, frankly speaking. They need to, perhaps step up, put their foot harder on the accelerator, and start thinking out of the box, if I might say so. I would like to thank all of you for coming today and giving us your really interesting and insightful insights. I mean, it's a difficult topic. I mean, it's a really important topic. So I really appreciate the time. EPC will be continuing to follow how this story plays out. Actually, on Monday, we have an event on Crimea marking the 8th anniversary of the temporary occupation. So I hope that many of you will also tune into that. So it only leaves me to say thank you on behalf of the EPC and the US, the State Department and the mission for joining us today. And I look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.